right, wonderful. We're going to be starting shortly. As you know, no coffee inside. Right, we're just about to start, so. That's all right. Are you joining us? Huh?
There's room.
Oh, there's totally room. We need your body.
Okay.
No offense.
No.
It's not to be too bold, but.
You can treat me as an object whenever you want.
Okay.
It's okay. For you, it's okay.
Okay, that's good. Are you here for the program? Go right on in. Here for the program? Yes. Okay, good.
Thank you.
You can't have you can put it in your pocket, but you can't eat it. It's the rule of the armory about the room. Well, yeah, but if they are on the list, take them in. Okay? Ready to go? That's all right. You can wait till the introduction's over. Have their water?
Yes.
Yeah, sure do.
You all have your water? You're all okay? Please. Perfect. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to TEFAF Coffee Talks. This is the fourth in our series of 5 coffee talks. We also have, I have to put a little word in for TEFAF afternoons. We'll have one this afternoon at 4 p.m., so you're welcome back for that. We try to bring together for these coffee talks the most interesting, thought-provoking conversations possible. And I think with the talent that we, as you see, have here this morning, we've been extremely lucky and fortunate to have a really great series this fair. I'm just going to introduce for you Deborah Fisher, who's Executive Director of A Blade of Grass, who'll be moderating today's panel on a topic that we are delighted to be presenting here at TEFAF New York Spring.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Let's see, I'm talking into the microphone. Okay. Hi. Thanks for coming. This is a panel about socially engaged art and institutions. And I want to just quickly introduce my fellow panelists. This is Miguel Luciano, who's an artist and an A Blade of Grass fellow. He's working on a great project that you'll hear more about with a number of different institutions. And then this is Kim Kanatani, who is the, hold on, let me consult my notes, the Gail Engelberg Director of Education at the Guggenheim, and Nat Trotman, who is the Curator of Performance and Media at the Guggenheim. They're going to talk about a project called Circle Through New York. Really quickly, though, I want to talk just for a second about socially engaged art, because it's good to define things. What is socially engaged art? A Blade of Grass is the first national organization that only works with socially engaged art. So I'm going to tell you our perspective about this. We do this through a fellowship program that does a nationwide open call, and it pairs $20,000 in unrestricted support with the creation of a lot of content: field research, a documentary film, public programs, and web and print-based content that is designed to share socially engaged art projects with a wider audience. We think about socially engaged art as artists sharing the creative process directly with other people and making meaning within a community context as opposed to an institutional context. So we work with projects that are happening in San Quentin Prison, in the public school system in New York City, in East Harlem, right? And so here's an example. These are all of the places that we've worked. We've worked in Gary, Indiana, New Orleans, St. Louis. We've worked in Quito, Ecuador with a project with Suzanne Lacey, the Zapatista Autonomous Rebel Municipalities. We can talk about that project later. That was super interesting. Athens, Greece. And just to give you a concrete example of an ablative grass project, this is a rendering by Dred Scott, who is a 2015 Ablative Grass Fellow. His project, Slave Rebellion Reenactment, is a community organizing venture that gathers 500 African-American people and about 100 white people in is it just me or is the microphone very loud now? Oh, is it okay? Okay, good. And it gathers about 600 people together in New Orleans to reenact the largest slave rebellion known to American history. And it does that by, well, anyway, we have very little time today, so I'm not going to go into the details of this. But what we're really thinking about today is how projects like this that are happening outside of a community, outside of an institution in a community context, work with communities specifically. So Miguel, let's talk about your project first.
Okay. Hello.
This one is super loud. Okay.
No, this is great. I'm just waiting for my images to come up. So while that's coming up, I'm thrilled to be one of the Ablative Grass Fellows this year. My practice, I'm a sculptor, painter, mixed media artist, and have done socially engaged art projects for a number of years in the different communities that I've lived in. I live in East Harlem, not far from here. Are we here?
No, that's the Guggenheim. Here, actually, that's next.
Okay.
That's the third thing.
Okay, sorry.
It's like
Actually, guys, we're not running the video just yet. We're going to be running the PowerPoint. The Luciano PowerPoint
Yeah.
is second.
Okay, here we are. So, okay, so this is some of my work. This is an image from a project this past year that really frames the work that I'm doing right now. This is from an exhibition at Brick. I had a solo show at Brick last year called Ride or Die. 2017 was the centennial mark of U.S. citizenship for Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans. I'm from Puerto Rico originally, grew up in the States, and my life has always kind of been back and forth between these two places, and my work for a long time has looked at sort of the historic relationship between these spaces that inform my own history and heritage. And especially now, sort of considering all of the very complicated issues that arise in this relationship. Because we are still a colony of the United States, we have a really problematic relationship to the U.S., a lot of which came to a head in 2016, 2017, even before the hurricane, during the debt crisis. And so, for those that don't know, we have an enormous debt crisis on the island, and there was a bill passed by Congress at the end of 2016 called the Promesa Act, which stands for the Puerto Rico Oversight Management and Economic Stability Act, which was intended to be sort of an economic relief program for Puerto Rico, but it was a really cruelly sort of titled bill that was a very bad promise. Essentially, it was a bill that protected the interests of the bondholders and the banks and Wall Street interests as a priority to be paid before the island got put back together. And so we're talking about an island that has well over 50% poverty rate, that has where social services and public programs have been decimated, hundreds of schools closed, hospitals. And this is all before the hurricane, so things really came to a head last year during the hurricane. So this bike from 1952, it's this double bike with one side representing the US, one side representing Puerto Rico. 1952 was the year of our Constitution. It was this kind of seminal moment that represented the potential of a new promise of autonomy and stability that was never realized. And so this piece in the slide is called Double Phantom, which is sort of a phantom of that past coming forward to the present. It's also a Schwinn phantom, or two Schwinn phantoms from 1952. And so embedded in a lot of the sculpture and the projects that I met are relationships to history and migration and really these critiques of colonialism. In spite of this, the message in the back in neon literally is pa'lante, which means to go forward, always forward. And that is sort of the hopeful message that it runs through, I think, hopefully, through a lot of my work in these sort of colonial critiques. But it comes from, it comes from the Young Lords. And so Pa'lante was the sort of mantra of the Young Lords Party. Young Lords were inspired by the Black Panthers. They were radical social justice activists based here in East Harlem. They were formed in Chicago, but their main center was in East Harlem, 1968-69. And so after that show, I got a grant from the Surdner Foundation to initiate a project about the history of our relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, but especially during times of crisis, looking at the implications of the debt crisis for the diaspora and how our communities connect to one another. The hurricane happened, everything has become much more intense, and I received support from Blade of Grass to extend and grow this project further. It begins by commemorating this history, and so the images I'm showing you here are from Hiram Marastani, who was the original photographer of the Young Lords, and is a friend who I've worked with in my community for some years. So these images are from 1969. This was the first office of the Young Lords on Madison between 111th and 112th. And these were some early projects in collaborations with Hiram, recreating the original storefront space of the Young Lords. It was for a show in East Harlem a couple years ago. And sort of reinterpreting this history 50 years later. So now we're at this anniversary moment of the 50-year sort of mark of the founding of the Young Lords. And so the work that's coming forward, this was another sort of adaptation of a famous poster that they did that I made into a sculpture, but these issues, health, food, housing, education, were the sort of platform community issues that they organized around. The garbage offensives, protests against sanitation, the lack of sanitation, services being provided in East Harlem. The Bronx March, these are some famous images, kind of iconic ones of the Young Lords. Police brutality, this was the death of Julio Rodan, who was a Young Lords member, killed while in police custody in '69. And finally, several images like this that are images of community resilience and resistance. And so I'm showing these images because this sort of begins this project that happens this summer, where we're turning some of these into billboards. These are not the final selections I'm showing you, but they're sort of marking this visual memory of resistance and activism in East Harlem at the spaces where these images were taken. And so they'll be enlarged as billboards that sort of reanimate this history at this 50-year anniversary mark. That's followed by a series of walking tours that retell these stories. The second phase is then developing a series of community action workshops in response to these images. thinking about how activists on the island today are responding to a new crisis, and putting that conversation of now in conversation with the past. Older generations working with newer generations to work out new strategies of resistance in our world today, in our communities today. So that's sort of a quick summary of the project that I'm involved in right now that's really just developing now over the summer. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And so now Kim is going to talk a little bit about Guggenheim social practice. And hey guys, we're going to show about 7 minutes of that 10-minute video. So is it okay if you're going to turn it off?
Great. Yeah. Let me just provide you all with a bit of background, institutional background actually, that leads up to the video that you're going to be seeing. Hopefully many of you know that the Guggenheim has a very long-standing history of working with artists whose work really relies upon public engagement in order for it to be realized. So in many ways, social practice art is just a natural extension of that. In 2014, we began Guggenheim Social Practice, hoping to explore ways in which artists and the museum can work together to develop new forms and approaches to public engagement that ideally would advance important social values as well. What we've embarked upon right now is really 3 commissions since that point, and what we'd like to highlight with you in the next few minutes is one of the inaugural commissions that were done by Lenka Clayton and John Rubin. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the video.
Actually, I will say as a preface to the video, you will all have found this circular handout in your seats, which is also related to this project. Lenka and John's project was called Circle Through New York, and it took place last year for 6 months. And unfortunately, neither Lenka nor John could be here with us today, which is why we'll be showing the video so you can hear their voices as well as voices of the community participants. But I just wanted to turn your attention also to this handout, which includes a brief text about the project on the reverse, as well as lists all of the project partners. And once you see the video, you will understand a bit more of the structure. So, with that.
It's like a story. I guess it's a little game that we play, we call gossip, and I say something, and I say it to you, and it goes, and by the time it gets to the end, it's a whole different story.
Circle Through New York. It's a project that decontextualizes life into life.
It's an imaginary circle that we drew through the Upper East Side, Harlem, the Bronx, and Queens. We selected 6 partners for the project: the Guggenheim Museum, St. Philip's Church, Pet Resources Pet Store, the Frank Sinatra High School, Just Broadcasting, and the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. We were looking for places that were incredibly different to each other, who existed for different reasons.
Each venue that we're working with is providing one essential aspect of their identity: a talking parrot, a high school drama class, a Punjabi TV show, the oldest song in the world, a museum artwork, and a congregation's call to action.
Each of the rotating elements will move 1 step each month and exist in each partner location.
And so what happens when places that are kind of held apart because of socioeconomics or geography or circumstance are placed together? What new dynamics occur?
Check, check, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Haha. Call to action, St. Philip's. All right, here we go.
When we got this St. Philip's, a call to action, which was the first one,
We came up with an idea to make sure that the people in the Bronx knew their rights.
This month here at the pet shop, we are going to tackle one of the things that this community has been plagued with, and that's knowing the rights, being arrested unjustly. They will call your family and offer you a lawyer free of charge. You got your rights right over here. And if you want to jump on the mic and tell us what happened, just come on over here and grab the mic.
All I say is just concentrate more on the people, you know? You're gonna go in and, you know, do your random stops. You know, gotta have probable cause. No matter what, we still got our freedom, we got our rights.
Yeah, well, hold on, we go. This project means to me a voice. Giving a voice to our customers and our clients. Every month something is different. It's a different experience for our community that ain't never happened before.
Kanatani yashasive Shinute suturi yahungara Kudurnita shakilatsili shipri Umaru hatuari.
It's a very special song. First of all, because it's the most ancient song that we know. On top there were the lyrics of the song. On the bottom there were instructions on how to play this song in on a harp. Even if it's 3,400 years old, 95% of the songs that we listen to have been written based on this same scale.
It catches you. I don't know if anybody else feels the way because I'm getting a lot of...
I can see that, you know, if you're circulating it through the city, everybody can have an opinion about this hymn, and everybody can sing this hymn from their perspective, and there we are. Wow, we're connected.
The challenge we had was to find locations that had something that could be sent, dislocated, and presented in all these other places, and then also have the capacity to host. You know, Just TV will be sending 4 live shows that they produce, and they'll be presented in each one of these locations.
Human being, inside heart is the same, blood is same, and the feeling is most important when we have to see each other.
Stand here.
If I no, go back.
Okay.
Then
just
then he talk something.
Okay.
You sponsor my ticket.
You want my ticket?
My.
You want your ticket?
Yes.
What John and Link are doing with the Circle to New York project is they're creating art in, you know, people's businesses and people's places of worship and people's place of education, and they're saying, you know, art doesn't have to be in a museum.
So this kind of the locations give us this opportunity to understand the culture and art and how we live our life.
Having a parrot here from the pet shop in the Bronx, which students drew and used as inspiration for movement and for choreography and dance creation. That was really different. We want to provide students an opportunity to go beyond themselves and beyond the structure of school, and this project allows us to do this.
Girl. Hi. A couple of people here have birds, but most do not. So most of us, me included, we have no idea. Sometimes she does get loud, and, you know, we're all on our phones and we're trying to, you know, record or do work or concentrate. And everyone, including the overnight staff, the weekend staff, everyone now knows how to put her to sleep and wake her up. And, you know, all of a sudden, we're all bird lovers.
Yeah, so I like that part. That's so touching. So now that we're all bird lovers, I think that, one thing to just kind of wrap all of this up and kind of define what socially engaged art is, it's an inclusive project, right? That happens by bringing lots and lots of stakeholders into a project, and that has real institutional ramifications, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about where the art is and who makes it, how that changes institutional relationships sometimes very drastically. So I want to start with like a really basic question, which is, Circle Through New York was a Guggenheim project that originated with the Guggenheim, but then displaced the Guggenheim somewhat and made them a participant, one of 6 participants. Whereas in Island Inland Promesas is a Miguel Luciano project that is bringing together many different organizational participants. So your list of institutional stakeholders includes A Blade of Grass, BRIC, the Met, Museo del Barrio, and Surdna. So that's like 5. So how do these relationships change when you have more than one institutional stakeholder? And how does having one institutional stakeholder work? Yeah.
That is a good question. That is sort of a little bit unknown at this stage because these are kind of new relationships that are overlapping. But my institutional partner, initially with this project about sort of mapping resistance in East Harlem and connecting it to activism in Puerto Rico, was within Museo del Barrio, which is my kind of hometown community institution. And an institution that is invested in that connection between the island and the diaspora very much. So I'm also beginning a residency at the Metropolitan, or with the Metropolitan, that starts now and overlaps with all of this. But that residency is also a very unique one in that it focuses on civic practice. And so it's very much will operate in support of the work that I'm already doing in my own community, and it was designed that way. So it's a very unique program that I don't think it's been formally announced yet, actually, but it's okay. This week I'll be at the Met on a panel Thursday talking about it with the other fellow. So
sneak preview.
Yeah, exactly. But the wonderful thing about it, in terms of all of the partners, is that the focus is actually away from institutions and is on communities. And there was a deliberate choice to work with artists who have community-centered practices. And that is a very unique moment in my own sort of like work and career where there is this convergence of interest and support. And at a really critical time, not just for me, but also I think for the issues that I'm interested in working around, particularly in relation to Puerto Rico.
Right, and conversely, Guggenheim taking on a project that decenters itself and its own institutional authority in its site is a fantastic endeavor. How did that go?
Well, I'll just start with an insight, and then I'll turn it over to Nat as well. But I think one of the things that was really brilliant about what John and Lenka did is that they considered us as one of the partners. I mean, it was tricky in that we were both the commissioner, yet we were both an active participant. And I think literally what was interesting about the institutional critique aspect of what they did was they literally removed us off our pedestal, and we became one of 6 other venue partners, all on an equal playing field. So for example, when we sent around our Felix Gonzalez Torres candy spill piece to Pet Resources, the pet store, the notion of how do you market it, how do you do the PR around it, it was totally up to Pet Resources in terms of how they wanted to program around it. So the Guggenheim imprimatur wasn't necessarily there, nor would it have been appropriate to be there as well. But
yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about a comparison between these two projects is that many socially engaged practices or socially engaged projects sort of require a number of institutional partners in order to bring about the funding. So there's sort of a necessity of relying on multiple literal resources. We were very lucky to have a substantial grant from the Rothschild Foundation that enabled us to have a budget for the entire project, which is something that was unique to the fact that we were a very well-known museum, are a very well-known museum that enabled that to happen. I don't know if that would have been able to happen if this had been a John and Lenka project that they had conceived independently and they had sort of gone around looking for funding for. It was instead that we received funding and then we invited them, right? So that was one difference.
That's an important difference.
But I also think that it's important to remember and recognize that all 6 of these partners were also institutions. So there was a cross-institutionality, and a big, as Kim was saying, a big part of the Circle project was to sort of work against the social assumptions that lead us not to think of the pet store as being an institution in the same way that we think of a museum as being an institution. So there was that was sort of going on.
I just want to add to that. There's one of the things that, my project was, my project partner, my institutional partner with this from the beginning was, and is, El Museo del Barrio. And the connection between the work that I'm doing about the activist history of East Harlem is absolutely connected to the history of that institution. And not a lot of people know that, but the Young Lords were founded in 1969 in East Harlem. El Museo del Barrio was founded in 1969 by artists, activists, educators. It was a community-driven institution and a community-focused one in its roots, and it's informed by the radical history of activism that was a part of our community from the very beginning. And so part of this is also reminding the community and the institution of its origin story, which is, it was a for us by institution founded by Puerto Rican artists, activists, educators, et cetera. So it's a really important thing to think about that is unique to New York City institutions in that way. The photos I showed you of Hiram Marstani, who was an original member and the official photographer of the Young Lords, was also the interim director of El Museo from like 74 to 77, something like that.
It's a very long interim.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it was, it was in its sort of building and growing years, but there are a lot of things like that that are not well known about our institutions and about our community. So I'm really interested in drawing that out.
And I think that's one really interesting difference between your project and Circle Through New York is that the way that history plays into both of these projects, because you're looking at an institution and a community and going a very deep dive into this complex and not always remembered history. Whereas because of the sort of nature of Circle Through New York, it didn't really have that much to do with the Guggenheim per se, other than the fact that the Guggenheim collects art and exhibits art. And so that was sort of that basic function. But it was a pretty, I mean this lovingly, but a pretty superficial understanding of what a museum does.
In large part because Lenka and John are very interested in chance operations and a history that might emerge, right? They're creating a new history as opposed to excavating a history.
Yeah, exactly.
And one thing that's interesting about the way that art works is that art can do lots of different things. It's not, a deep history is not necessarily better than a new history in an art context. They're different. Yeah, and that ability to make qualitative distinctions between things is something that art brings to a discussion about power, actually, because, one of the things that is very interesting here is the role of institutional critique. Kim, you brought it up as something that John and Lenka were very specifically addressing in your project, in Circle Through New York, was the idea that the Guggenheim needed to be one of 6 collaborators and be on equal footing with the pet store and on equal footing with the high school and on equal footing with everybody else, right? How did that work inside of the Guggenheim, and what challenges did you face?
Well, I think one of the things that we were interested in from the outset was it's interesting how artists can come in and create hopefully positive paradigm shifts for the institution in ways in which that we are working.
And there's a deep history that Miguel is pointing to, yes.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that an artist can come in, and basically we treated Circle Through New York as an exhibit, that the tables were turned, the artists were determining what the exhibit is, when it was going to be installed, and it was a very different role, but not maybe from the curatorial standpoint as well.
It definitely had some differences. I'd say the biggest differences within the way that normal exhibitions work were, yes, Linka and John had a certain level of directorial capacity that is different from many shows, but not all. Certainly when we did our Tino Segal show, or when we worked with Tanya Bruguera or others, there are artists who have borne that sense of authority over the operations of the museum in the past. But it was really, the biggest challenge was asking a lot of people at the museum to do things that they didn't normally do, that were outside of their comfort zone, and to perform. Sort of the whole nature of the project was that everyone around the circle had to perform their identity and their social role to an audience in a way that they weren't used to. So as strangers walked into the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, or Just Broadcasting, or the Pet Store, they sort of had to relate, not as a normal clientele who had another reason to be there, but there was this artificial reason. And for the people in the museum, that meant singing the oldest song in the world in the middle of your working day, or especially when we did the call to action, which was the last thing that the Guggenheim had in July of last year, going through this workshopping process of doing listening exercises where we then just exposed ourselves to the public, a wide variety of people from different departments, and just talked to them about social change and what the role of a museum could be in a time of political upheaval, and just tried to receive as much information from the public as possible. And that was very much outside of my comfort zone and outside of a lot of other people's comfort zones.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's interesting. We're going to get back to that in just a second. But Miguel, one of the things that you're doing in your collaboration with El Museo is also, well, in the Met, is also opening themselves up to listening to community or becoming more community focused, right? So, and you are very much a collaborator with those institutions in that goal. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, that's why I was selected, I think, for that, for these projects. My role is different in this work that I'm doing also just in my own practice. It's shifting more towards organizing events and exchanges, so I showed a sculptural piece, but I've been making interactive sculpture sort of with that purpose in mind for years, and then doing other projects that are really sort of collaborative, interactive actions and events. And so a lot of the work coming forward this summer that uses this kind of history to frame a moment of reference in terms of how our communities have responded to crisis in the past, allows for this exchange today in a new crisis that would bring activists from the island together with activists in my community in East Harlem, folks that are doing, for example, work around food justice and food sovereignty, especially at a time when the entire farming of the island was wiped out and needed to be reseeded. And a lot of that support, not just in terms of food, but in terms of supplies in general, came from the diaspora. And so there was like radical action and organizing, much of which was inspired by things like the actions of the Black Panthers and Young Lords, for example, the free breakfast programs, and sort of like DIY sort of responses to community needs in the face of government failure. All of that is happening again 50 years later in new spaces. And so the project basically becomes a space through a series of new workshops around those platform issues, health, food, housing, education, to bring activists that are doing creative work in those areas together to share space and to create new strategies, basically.
Well, and that brings me to really kind of the fundamental question around social practice, which is why now Nat, you were really clear about saying that this brought you outside of your comfort zone, right? Like taking in this kind of information, and that can be a really great thing, but it can also be really challenging. And so, what was the benefit of that? What did the Guggenheim?
Well, to you,
both. Yeah, both. I think it's interesting to talk about both.
I mean, ideally, when it's successful, it would lead to getting outside of our comfort zones, would lead to breaking down a lot of the entrenched, old-fashioned ways of relating to the audience of the museum. And I think everyone knows, I hope everyone knows, that these days that institutions need to be thinking about their publics in different ways. I'd like to think that happened. It happens on an individual level and it happens on a policy level at the same time. So certainly asking people to do things that are outside of their comfort zone affects change on a personal level and allows people to, I mean, frankly, usually people want to break out of, at least at the Guggenheim, people want to break out of the roles and they need a platform, of an authorized platform in order to do so. And so having a project like this come in through as an exhibition and be listed as being an official, full-fledged program of the museum allows a way for that desire to be realized. In terms of changing policy, it's more complicated, but it's also having it as a full-fledged exhibition and knowing that the museum values this kind of work enables curators and other people at the museum to put forward different kinds of projects.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the subtexts, right, that is running through both of these projects is that the projects themselves create a third space, you know, and one of the things that I think that third space really needs in order to do this work well is trust. Right? So, I mean, how do you, as an institutional partner and as an artist, how do you each address trust building in these projects?
Between institutions or with communities, you mean? Yeah, well, the trust, I mean, with communities and individuals is based on relationships that take time. And so these are not things that I started doing right now. These are sort of projects that are culminating as a result of relationships that have been active for a number of years in many cases. The institutional relationships are newer, but the exciting thing for me is that I'm working often with people in education and public programs, like amazing people who I feel like are more connected to the communities that institutions are serving oftentimes, and that's been my history as an artist, just, you know, exhibiting as well. And I love that part of it. So it requires that kind of relationship also for this to work, you know. There's got to be trust both ways on some level. And I think, you know, these are projects that are not traditional or typical for institutions themselves. So it challenges, it's watching the institutions open themselves up to critique and growth, and allowing artists to sort of lead those conversations sometimes. And even more exciting is allowing communities to lead those conversations.
It requires bravery on the part of the institution.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with Miguel. I mean, having spent all my career as a museum educator, I feel in some ways that social practice artists are really lifting the things that we value the most, which is collaboration, partnership, active audience engagement, and using it as process and content to their work. So in that way, this social practice art is right at the crossroads for me. That's perfect in terms of melding education, art, and community engagement all into one area.
We should open it up to the questions from the community. Who has any questions?
And I believe Linda has a microphone here at the back for you, since this is being recorded.
Great panel, guys. My name is Manon Sloan. I'm the co-founder of No Longer Empty, and I'm ex-Guggenheim. So I mentioned intersection of institution and community-based work. My first question was, when you had the circle at the Guggenheim, was there an admission fee for people to come from those communities into the museum?
Yes. Yeah. The idea, and we discussed this a lot with John and Linka, but actually the sort of concept that they had was that each of the 6 places, as part of the sort of equalization, would behave the way they always do. So if you needed to pay to get into one of them, that you would pay to get into just like you normally would. However, they did do we did as much as possible to schedule the events and other sort of interventions during the pay-as-you-wish hours, which are on Saturday. So like when the Just Broadcasting was there, that happened when you saw him interacting with the people in line. Those were people waiting to get in on the free night. So that it used the existing resources within the museum to open it as much as possible. We also did things outside of the museum. I mean, the idea of bringing the Felix Gonzalez Torres out of the museum and moving it around, that was free throughout, obviously.
Because it's kind of interesting, you know, Kim's role in the education and how often, say, take Pablo Helguera at MoMA, how often these projects do come into the institution through the educational departments, and, you know, your performative. And I mean, how far do you think that institutional critique can really expand your notions of publics? And that's why the cost came in, because, of course, you have these type of costs which are restrictive to so many families coming into the museum context.
Sorry, I can repeat the question. She just asked where we can hear the oldest song. So I should have said, it should be listed on the Circle handout if you have one. There's a website for the project which is still live called circlethroughnewyork.com, and you can hear you can hear multiple different interpretations of the song there. There is no original because it was on a tablet. So there's the one that we first heard through that the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World had produced, and then each of the other partners' versions are all there.
My name is Daniela Bertol. I am an artist, and I wonder if you can provide a definition of socially engaged art, because art by its own ontology as an action of making a personal, intimate world accessible, communicated to the world, it's a social action. What differentiates social art?
That's a great question. And from my perspective, we're thinking social practice can be defined in 1,000 different ways, obviously, and I think that that's a really important feature of art, that it can be anything. So you're going to get a different answer from me about this than the people who run Queen's Social Practice MFA, for example. But I think that for A Blade of Grass, the organizing ideas are artists working directly in community, and that community-based practice being the core aesthetic component, right? So Dred Scott's project is actually a really interesting example, because what he's doing is he's taking a history, right? This slave rebellion happened, and it was about 500 slaves marching very quietly, actually, from La Place, Louisiana, down to the outskirts of New Orleans, about where the airport is today, right? So basically, what he's doing is he's trying to use people, right, and use their own desire to learn this history and to talk about what it means to them and to talk about what it means to move that history forward in their lives as the organizing principle to get 500 people to do that and to make a visual experience of this kind of performance of people marching for 2 days dressed in period costumes with cane knives and muskets and, kind of taking over a large quantity of space, right? So there's a visual component to that work, but a key part of the aesthetic, and I think that this is what makes something social practice, is the way that Dredd is organizing those people. He's not using social media. He's keeping everything a secret. And a lot of that is because when slaves would tell one another about this rebellion, they would risk their lives to do so, right? So what he's doing is he's creating a community of trust that kind of ignores a lot of the way that we organize today in order to get a very specifically deep experience that is carried inside of each individual. And I think that that's actually a key component of how social practice works. It's sitting inside of the people who all became bird lovers. It's sitting inside, it's in the relationship between you and Hiram, and the food, and so that, and the outcomes are almost secondary. And I think that that's a fascinating component of this practice.
Jordan Coffey from the University of California. And I'm asking in a sense to, how do you say, I guess gather metrics from the social outcomes of these works. So as we enter museums, there's clearly clicks to count heads, but there's a rippling effect from these works that kind of elevate consciousness and awareness. So what are you guys currently doing to keep a metric and follow up on these people who encounter these spaces?
I mean, I can say one thing, which is not, it's a non-answer, and then I should let Kim give a real answer. It's something that we went back and forth a great deal about in planning the Circle Through New York project, because actually the funders often expect a reportable, demonstrable, effect in terms of numbers. And we had to think very hard about how quantifiable impact can get in the way of qualitative impact, and how in this particular project, and I think it's up for debate whether this is a sign of its success or not and how one measures success, so much of the impact happened on one-to-one interactions and very, very local moments. So when we're working with Aubrey at the, I know you were a little late, I don't know if you saw the video, but who was the sort of our main point person at the pet store in the Bronx. And I mean, we talked to him and he felt a huge amount of impact from the project. Can we, are there numbers of the number, did we count how many people moved through the store and saw and interacted with each of the interventions that took place there over 6 months? It might not be a vast number of people, but how do you balance the effectiveness of the handful of people who work there having this really profound experience with, it not being thousands of people who moved through that space? And I don't have an answer for how to balance that and which matters more.
But I think what was really important for us all who were involved, funder included, funder aside, is that the qualitative analysis is where the real assessment is at. We had an evaluator who was embedded with us for the past 4 years, quite frankly, and followed both of these inaugural projects. And we're very proud of the way in which she customized her approach. It wasn't the traditional, okay, so what are your goals? What are your objectives? And then at the end, we'll figure out whether you met those goals, but rather she employed an approach called developmental evaluation for highly innovative projects that you don't know the outcomes for. So basically what she became, and this is something that Blade of Grass is very familiar with, is like a field reporter. And she tracked all the different decisions that we made, where we needed to do course corrections, and why it was we did it, so that we could be held accountable for what it was we did. But her message was really quite, her method was really quite qualitative. It involved a lot of interviews, a lot of observations with all of the key stakeholders. So it was really a 360-degree, from the artists, from the community participants, the public who observed it, including the museum staff, all the way up to the director, as well as the funders, so that she could see where we were all in sync or not. So she was invaluable in that way, in terms of trying to get us all on the same page, so that the misunderstanding at the end from any of these parties would be avoided.
Yeah, I think, yeah, no problem. I also want to respond to this, because what A Blade of Grass does field research on every project. We don't call it evaluation, actually, because evaluation it reinforces a lot of power dynamics that we're organizing around questioning and being creative about. So, but we do have a director of field research who does qualitative assessment using a similar methodology to developmental, what is that called? Developmental research? Is what she calls it. Yeah, so it's very similar. It's called action research, and it's actually something that one of the things that we're interested in is the idea that action research can be done within any group by participants. It's incredibly simple. It's it's developed by, among other things, by teachers to evaluate their own work, and to work in groups to evaluate themselves, so that because in schools, often people who are like administrators or working in a university to teach teachers how to teach are the ones who are kind of setting directives, right, for teachers. And action research is a way to disrupt that hierarchy a little bit and get the people who are doing the work with students, in that case, to set their own metrics. So we use a very similar technique where we the artists are defining the terms of the research itself, and then we're using a very consistent methodology to account for our own subjectivity by participating in the piece, and then also interviewing a large number of stakeholders to tell stories about the project. And what we're hoping to do with this is to create a different way of making assumptions about things like impact and assessment that have become very loaded words, actually, in a philanthropy discourse, because of the exact thing that you are bringing up and that Nat is seconding, right? Which is that most of the change that happens in these projects is change within, like, I don't want to sound corny, but it's like change within a heart. Do you know? Like, and getting a story about that, it doesn't look like qualitative, generalizable data. It just doesn't look like that. So so one of the things that we're really thinking through is, how do we change the story of what change looks like by doing this in an art context? And I think that that's actually something that an arts institution can play a really helpful role in, because we don't have the same accountabilities that, say, a social services organization has. And that's something that needs to get explored and exploited more.
That's a great question. And I just would add to that what I think is unique about A Blade of Grass too, though, is that even in terms of how your application is framed, and I say this because I teach a seminar at SVA, and I teach in the MFA Fine Arts program at SVA. I teach a seminar in the fall on socially engaged art in public space. And so we've used actually the application from A Blade of Grass to sort of frame questions around, for students, for grad students, around how they think about art and social change, and the sort of potentiality for actual change in these art projects, right? And so my students will each fall kind of propose through the semester a project and sort of develop that proposal, not for a blade of grass necessarily, but like for something that's realizable, you know? Asking core questions about how does your project actually create social change? And even if it's an exercise, it's like a really important one to consider that potentiality beyond a gesture, beyond an object. And that question has to be considered then in relationship to the world, to the communities that people are thinking about and working with. And, you know, these are exercises in the seminar that I teach, but it's a really sort of healthy, I think, way of thinking beyond our studio practices of how the work we do. And I'm not saying that, like, you know, social and politically motivated paintings, for example, don't make an impact, but it's a different kind of work and it's a different kind of world that they exist in, you know? So it's like reaching beyond the traditional forms to think about exchanges and relationships and social action. So it's a great question, and it's honestly the question that I ask every single year to my students, and I ask that in my own work, you know, all the time. It's not always answerable, but I think what we do is we look at sort of best practices, and we look at projects that don't work, you know, and including my own experience. Like, I look at sort of like successes and failures, you know, in these different endeavors, and it's important to talk about the failures, you know, and acknowledge them even when they exist in the contemporary art world, you know, in relation to institutions sometimes too. So it's having honest conversations and critiques about what's working and not working, you know, and what's sort of, you know, it can feel like a superficial gesture and what can feel like something that really is received impactfully or a substantive kind of like transformation somehow occurring. But again, it's hard to actually qualify those experiences.
Hi, my name is Jae-hee. I'm a second-year student in the Arts Administration program at TC. And so as institutions are providing more and more social roles, I feel that those efforts often fall, like such as public programs and community engagement programs, they often fall under the parameter of education department. And I'm wondering how those values and conversations are being shared and communicated throughout thinking about it in the context of trust building and relationship building within the organization itself, you know, and also in context of like organizational power structure and internal bureaucracy and et cetera.
Well, I think one of the big impactful paradigm shifts that's going on within our institution is that education is now working side by side with curatorial as a commissioner of art projects. So now I am, and my team is in the business of actually curating and commissioning art projects. We felt, for the reference that I made earlier about my background as an educator and how it aligns so nicely with the good work that social practice artists are doing, and then, you know, bringing in the curatorial component. So that's where, and then Nat also alluded to the fact that this is an institution-wide effort. You don't silo I mean, it requires exhibition management, it requires curatorial education. So it was all hands on deck, particularly with this particular project. So I think that's where the social change happened in a big way within our institution in terms of the ways in which we work.
I would say, I mean, A Blade of Grass is a really different organization, obviously, right? Like, I mean, we're tiny and we were founded in 2011, and this is all we do. So that presents a number of very interesting challenges and opportunities. We have no choice because we only work with artists who are actively addressing power systems and engaging in, you know, community-based work to be very rigorous in our own social practice, right? So we have a socially engaged board in a lot of ways. We engage in a lot more discourse and trust building because all of the projects that we take on are very risky. You know, I mean, we've done projects that are trying to do things like smuggle money to the Zapatistas, you know, a little bit. So, not really, but the, so
being recorded, you know.
It was very indirect and symbolic, and it's an art project. But the so I mean, I guess so. We talk about each project to a degree that would, and we work on a consensus level that is very rare in an arts institution, actually, and it's very beautiful. And you know, we have to critique our own power by ourselves. You know, we can't rely on artists to do it for us. So so we're very that gives us a lot of flexibility, and it also gives us a lot of homework, you know, all the time. Yeah. So I mean, I guess to answer your question, you can go really far with this. It's possible. Yeah.
Okay, I want to thank the panel very much for this. Sorry, I'm always standing too close to that. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank the panel for this fabulous conversation. As somebody who works in partnerships and associations all the time, they're making it sound easy, relatively easy until you've been on the inside of trying to build. It always sounds really good, partnering. Oh, great idea. Until you start getting into the details and the nitty-gritty of doing it. One more thing I must say is to thank Denise Saul for the great favor she did for me to put me in touch with Kim, that was the genesis of this panel. So I'm very grateful for that. And one thing I always forget to do, but I want to definitely say here, is that every program we do is live streamed and online. And if you would like, because of all the amazing amount of information that's gone on in this panel, you can easily go back immediately now and refer to this online. So this and the wonderful PowerPoints and video will be available to you and archived on the website. So we're very happy about that. So of course, a huge hand of applause for a wonderful, wonderful panel.